On November 9, 2024, should Donald Trump secure the presidency once more, many will view it as a ratification of existing power structures. Yet in that precise moment, without conscious intent, he would be signing the death certificate of white supremacy. This is not because of personal righteousness or intent, but because history dictates that flawed vessels are often used to accomplish profound historical shifts. Consider the archetypes of Pharaoh or Nebuchadnezzar, figures representing the pinnacle of the systems they defended, yet utilized to precipitate those systems' ultimate downfall. What audiences must prepare to witness is something easily obscured by the noise of another election cycle. Beyond the political theater lies a deeper, foundational pattern that has been unfolding since the earliest. Auction blocks were constructed on American soil, a pattern rooted in ancient prophetic timetables. What is occurring presently is not random chaos. It is prophetic mathematics, and the numbers tell an undeniable story. Donald Trump did not awaken with the intention of dismantling systemic oppression. His stated goal is restoration of a perceived past greatness. However, history reveals that every empire built upon subjugation carries an internal timer. This timer does not pause simply because the oppressed grow weary of counting. Divine accounting continues. Ancient texts, such as Revelation 18, explicitly describe the fall of imperial structures not due to external weakness, but because their accumulated inequities have reached a breaking point, demanding a double reckoning. To understand this trajectory, one must examine the buried markers of history. The year 1619 marked the arrival of the first enslaved Africans in Virginia, 20 souls, stolen from Angola, establishing year zero for black captivity in America. Applying a biblical framework, specifically the 400-year timeline, of enslavement and subsequent deliverance, mentioned in Genesis 15:13, we arrive at the year 2019. If that year marked the conclusion of a 4-century cycle, then everything transpiring from 2020 onward represents the accelerated phase of exit, upheaval, and the unveiling of systemic fragility. Here is the crucial paradox. Trump's political actions, intended to fortify the existing order, actually accelerate the collapse he seeks to prevent. Every executive action designed to restore a specific vision of order exposes the structural cracks. Nationalist policies reveal a deep-seated fear of losing control. Judicial decisions meant to roll back progress indicate a realization that time is running short. They are attempting to secure the foundation while the ground shifts beneath them. This mirrors the historical archetype of Pharaoh in Exodus, who, upon facing demands for freedom, increased oppression by demanding bricks without straw. He tightened his grip precisely because he sensed the inevitable end. We are currently witnessing that tightening, which signals proximity to a definitive breaking point. Trump is not the cause of white supremacy's potential collapse. He is the symptom of its desperation, the system chosen as its loudest defender, one who articulates the quiet subtext and removes the mask of civility. By making the implicit explicit, he renders continued pretense impossible. The mythology of the nation dies when the reality becomes too blatant to ignore. The system required a belief in its inherent nobility, that the Constitution was colorblind, and that slavery was merely an unfortunate blemish on a perfectible experiment. It required faith that reform was possible, through sufficient hard work and responsible voting. Trump's governance, however, shattered that narrative, revealing an operating system, originally designed by and for propertied white men to protect their specific interests. Once that original intent is laid bare, it cannot be unseen. Yet, in a profound reversal, what is meant for harm creates the conditions for revelation. Trump aimed to restore greatness for a specific demographic, but in doing so, he triggered a massive awakening among those historically excluded from that greatness. The record voter turnout among Black Americans in 2020 was not merely about enthusiasm for a candidate. It was a demonstration that the veil had been torn. Once the machinery behind the curtain is visible, a return to slumber is impossible. To understand imperial cycles, consider the Daniel chapter 2 imagery of the statue composed of degrading metals, ending in feet of iron mixed with clay, strong yet inherently brittle, held together by force, but cracking under its own weight. A subsequent term for Trump represents the iron attempting to hold the clay. It is structurally unsound. The metaphorical stone, representing a multi-ethnic kingdom ungovernable by the old order, is already in motion. However, this understanding should not lead to passivity. Awareness of the cycle does not negate the necessity of action. One must still march toward the Red Sea even before it parts. Preparation for imperial collapse requires understanding that white supremacy is not merely individual prejudice. It functions as a religious system. It possesses priests in the form of politicians who sanctify injustice into law, doctrines such as manifest destiny, liturgies like the bootstrap mythology, sacraments including credit scores and zip codes, and a central deity of whiteness as the mediator of power and humanity. Trump functions as an honest high priest of this system, performing its rituals without guilt or apology, which galvanizes a base that feels their country. Their lease on dominance is expiring. And indeed, the lease is up, not due to external political forces, but because of the immutable law of sowing and reaping. 4 centuries of planting slavery, Jim Crow, redlining, mass incarceration, and economic extraction inevitably leads to a harvest. Trump's presence serves as the exposure before the judgment, a warning shot. Yet, historical patterns suggest systems rarely repent. They double down, like Babylon declaring, "I sit as queen, I will never mourn." American exceptionalism asserts its untouchability even as indicators of decline flash red. Trump triggers the unmasking, where institutions stop pretending neutrality. In that clarity, a choice becomes unavoidable. Keep attempting integration into a collapsing structure, or begin building something new while there is time. History provides a sobering precedent in the Compromise of 1877, which ended Reconstruction. A political backroom deal traded black freedom for power, withdrawing federal troops and dismantling 12 years of progress in schools, land ownership, and representation. This was not a failure of black effort. It was a systemic redesign. Every historical breakthrough for black Americans has been met with a fierce backlash. Emancipation led to black codes. The Civil Rights Act led to the war on drugs. The first black president led to Trump. This is strategy, not coincidence. The current political landscape is Reconstruction's betrayal in high definition. It is the system declaring that the arc of the moral universe does not bend toward justice without intense resistance. The mask is off, revealing that the nation's structures were never designed for universal flourishing. This brutal clarity is liberating. It validates the lived experience of marginalized communities, proving that the data is real. Acceptance of this reality allows one to stop begging for inclusion in a system built on exclusion and begin the practical work of preparing for a true exodus. This exodus is not primarily geographic, though it may be for some. It is spiritual, economic, and psychological. It is an exodus from the logic of Egypt, from defining success by the oppressor's metrics. It is a refusal of the taskmasters who equate freedom with irresponsibility. We are witnessing modern plagues, financial collapses, pandemics, social uprisings, supply chain failures, inflation, and evaporating trust in institutions. These are not random events. They are the convulsions of a system under judgment, birth pangs of a new order. Pharaoh's heart is hardened, not arbitrarily, but because he has repeatedly chosen empire over ethics and power over humanity. America's current leadership faces similar models that no longer function, yet they continue to build using the same blueprints. Trump, by ripping the scab off the wound of racial inequity, has exposed the infection, demanding treatment or amputation. The system will likely chase those seeking liberation, passing laws to control every aspect of existence, because it cannot conceive of itself without its foundational hierarchy. The promise of deliverance, however, is not based on human perfection but on divine faithfulness to historical timetables. The waters split not because it is earned, but because the promise was made. Yet, the most critical phase occurs after the initial deliverance. The Israelites wandered for 40 years, not because the path was physically long, but because they mentally remained in Egypt. They feared the giants in the land more than they trusted their deliverance. This is the danger of the present moment. A generation freed from Egypt, dying in the wilderness because they prefer the familiarity of oppression to the risks of true freedom. We are facing a Red Sea moment where the system chases itself into collapse. Following this, there will be a wilderness period requiring immense trust and new strategies. The old leadership models of protest must give way to strategies of economic sovereignty, educational autonomy, and sophisticated spiritual warfare. Trump has triggered an unavoidable choice between integration into a dying empire and the construction of a new order. The tragedy is that some will choose the familiar comforts of Egypt, investing in the empire's currency even as it fails. Others will experience an ancestral awakening, a realization that they cannot allow their children to inherit these chains. They will move with holy urgency. The real battle is not convincing white supremacy to end, but convincing the oppressed that they are still captive to a system that has merely rebranded its chains. Liberation is not a title at a corporation funding private prisons. That is merely comfortable captivity. The response to this awakening must be tactical. First, it requires intense, strategic prayer that breaks generational curses and intercedes for a people. Second, it demands rigorous study. One must read the historical documents, the slave codes, the insurance policies on human cargo, the redlining maps, the 1994 crime bill to know the enemy's playbook by their own words. Third, parallel economies must be built. Black banks, land trusts, food cooperatives, and infrastructure that does not depend on imperial permission. When the empire falters, sustainable alternatives must be in place. Fourth, mentorship is crucial. The next generation must be taught their true identity before 1619 as mathematicians, astronomers, and kings, not merely descendants of slaves. Finally, unify not in uniformity, but in aligned purpose toward liberation and restoration. Trump did not just trigger the potential end of white supremacy, he triggered the demand for a decision. It is vital to understand that the end of white supremacy is not the end of white people. The biblical vision of the future kingdom is profoundly multi-ethnic. What dies is the ideology that made whiteness supreme, the structure that distributed dignity based on proximity to European features. That system is terminal. Trump is the fever spike before the crisis. When that system falls, those attached to it fall as well. The call is to evacuate Babylon ideologically and economically before its collapse. The gospel becomes urgent in this context. Not a prosperity gospel, but the declaration that a new kingdom is at hand, one that cannot be shaken. Trump is a prophetic sign, a modern Belshazzar feasting, while the handwriting appears on the wall declaring that the kingdom has been weighed and found wanting. The accounting for centuries of stolen labor and life is coming due. By governing exactly as he does, Trump adds line items to this ledger, forcing a choice with no middle ground remaining. This matters profoundly for the next generation. The story of deliverance must be told to them in its raw reality that God takes sides against oppression. If they are not taught this, they will normalize the system and attempt integration into structures designed for their extraction. This is generational warfare for the imagination of the children. Therefore, parents must become primary educators, discipling their children in truth so they have the discernment to refuse the empire's bribes, much like Moses refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing solidarity with the oppressed over the treasures of Egypt. The wilderness generation died because they romanticized their slavery, preferring the certainty of oppression to the uncertainty of freedom. That mentality is lethal. Comfort is not the goal. Freedom and righteousness are. Trump's presidency crystallized decades of building pressure, showing the operating system raw and unedited. The choice now is whether to keep trying to debug a system working as designed or to accept its nature and build anew. The fall of white supremacy is the collapse of a demonic system that has enslaved everyone, including poor whites manipulated into protecting a hierarchy that exploits them. The collapse offers a slim chance for true, multi-ethnic solidarity among those who detach from the Babylon system and identify, first, as citizens of a higher kingdom. Trump cannot stop this. The system can only thrash as it drowns. The question is whether one is in the water with it or watching from the far shore. The theological anchor here is deep. The historical curse of Ham was a deliberate theological lie used to justify brutality, a misreading of Scripture that the Vatican and Protestant churches alike utilized to sanctify genocide and enslavement. Trump's presidency exposes how many of these operational lies remain. The lie of a post-racial society, the lie of fair meritocracy, the lie that slavery ended rather than evolved. The 13th Amendment's exception, clause allowing involuntary Servitude as punishment for crime did not abolish slavery. It outsourced it to the criminal justice system. Black codes immediately criminalized black existence, feeding the convict leasing system that generated massive revenue for Southern states. Long after the Civil War, this evolved into the war on drugs, explicitly designed to disrupt black communities and feed the prison industrial complex, where private prisons profit from black bodies. Trump supercharged this with law and order, rhetoric, and Justice Department policies. God is not ignorant of this suffering. The timing of George Floyd's murder on Memorial Day 2020, amidst a global lockdown, was a prophetic exposure. It forced the world to witness the reality of systemic violence. Trump's response, tear gassing. Protesters for a photo op revealed the system's true nature. America was founded and operates on white supremacy. From the 3/5 compromise to modern economic apartheid created by FHA redlining, which engineered a massive wealth gap. Trump's 2017 tax cuts further exacerbated this transfer of wealth. Every act of extraction is recorded. Empires built on exploitation inevitably devour themselves. Trump's "Make America Great Again" mirrors Nebuchadnezzar's arrogant boast before his fall. The evidence suggests America is doubling down like Pharaoh rather than repenting like Nineveh. The attacks on history, book bans, and refusal to address systemic issues are signs of a hardened heart. Therefore, the call is to come out of her. This is a process. It begins with the internal decision that one's identity is not defined by the empire. It requires building parallel infrastructure, credit unions, food systems, educational pods that serve the community rather than extracting from it. It means decoupling identity from external validation and discipling children in truth. It requires aggressive, Daniel-like prayer and naming the enemy not as flesh and blood, but as spiritual principalities. Economic sovereignty is essential. The curse of being the tail and not the head, always borrowing, must be reversed. The velocity of money in black communities is devastatingly slow. Dollars must circulate internally to build power. Every economic decision is a spiritual vote. Trusting in divine provision rather than systemic handouts allows for generational thinking and the creation of arcs before the flood. The signs of systemic failure are everywhere. Political polarization, economic instability, social unrest. Trump is the catalyst making the choice binary. The wilderness test is recognizing that the giants in the land, the entrenched systems, are not bigger than the ultimate reality of divine justice. The weapons of this warfare are truth, unity, creativity, and economic discipline. The end of white supremacy was determined long ago. The current task is to position oneself to survive its collapse and thrive in the reality that follows. This is the hour for the Joshua generation to arise, possess their inheritance, and build the new while the old dissolves.